Most fathers fight with their sons about staying out late or picking careers. Ivan IV used a metal-tipped walking stick to hit his son in the head. One hit. End of fight. End of a royal family. November 1581. Prince Ivan, age 27, tried to talk sense into a man who thought talking was weak. A man who had replaced kindness with killing orders. It went badly. One crack later, the Rurik family line was over. 700 years of rule bled out on the palace floor. Here's what stays with you: Ivan had been practicing this for years. Every tortured noble. Every fearful order. Every late-night killing. It was all building up. In the end, he destroyed his own family with the same hands he used to build an empire. They call him terrible like it sums him up. It doesn't. He started as a golden boy. Loved by the people. Full of hope. What turned him into a monster wasn't being mean, it was sadness. And that somehow makes it worse. Russia in 1547 had every reason to feel good. Their new 16-year-old king, Ivan IV, was everything a country could want. Smart, well-taught, and really cared about fairness. He'd already lived through a rough childhood. Rival noble families literally fought over his throne while he watched from the side, powerless and scared. But instead of getting bitter, young Ivan used that hurt to make changes. He created the first Russian law book that treated nobles and common people the same. A big deal back then. He set up local government in towns across the empire. Most importantly, he picked smart advisors who knew what they were doing, not just people who said nice things about him. The early Ivan was obsessed with being fair. He'd spend hours listening to poor people complain about corrupt officials. He'd personally look at court cases that other kings would have ignored. Russian writers from this time describe him as the people's protector, a king who remembered what it felt like to be helpless. Soon enough, he'd be reminding others of that same feeling. His military wins were just as impressive. While other European rulers fought over tiny pieces of land, Ivan was taking over entire kingdoms. Kazan fell in 1552. Astrakhan in 1556. The Siberian expansion began under his watch. Russia was becoming a real superpower, and Ivan was the smart leader making it happen. Foreign ambassadors wrote glowing reports back to their countries. The Venetian envoy described Ivan as wise beyond his years with a memory that captures every detail, a trait that would prove bad for anyone who crossed him. Ivan never forgot when someone wronged him. The English were so impressed they offered a military partnership. Even the Ottoman Empire, usually dismissive of Christian rulers, treated Ivan with real respect. But the most telling sign of Ivan's early promise, his people loved him truly. Peasants would travel hundreds of miles just to ask him for help directly, convinced he'd listen. And he did. August 7, 1560. Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan's beloved wife of 13 years, dies suddenly after a brief illness. The official cause, natural complications. The reality, Ivan becomes convinced she was poisoned by jealous people who couldn't stand seeing a common woman influence their king. Here's where everything goes wrong. Anastasia wasn't just Ivan's wife, she was his anchor to sanity. For over a decade, she'd been the one person who could calm his explosive temper. Who could talk him down from his darker thoughts. Palace servants later recalled how Ivan would rage at some perceived betrayal, only to soften completely when Anastasia entered the room. Unfortunately, no one thought to train a replacement for this rather specialized skill. Without her, the brilliant young reformer becomes something else entirely. Ivan starts seeing enemies everywhere. That advisor who suggested a tax reform. Obviously plotting against the throne. The foreign ambassador who seemed too interested in Russian military capabilities. Definitely a spy. Paranoia, it turns out, is remarkably easy to master once you put your mind to it. The paranoia shows up in increasingly weird ways. Ivan begins testing his food with silver spoons, convinced someone's trying to poison him. He moves his sleeping quarters randomly, never staying in the same room twice. Most disturbing of all, he starts keeping detailed lists of people who've wronged him. But Ivan's grief does something even more dangerous than breed paranoia, it makes him cruel. The man who once spent hours listening to peasant complaints now finds twisted pleasure in watching executions. He begins personally designing torture methods, convinced that extreme pain will force confessions from his imagined enemies. The change is so complete that foreign ambassadors start sending warnings back to their courts. The reasonable, just ruler they'd been dealing with has been replaced by someone unpredictable and vicious. Anastasia's death didn't just break Ivan's heart, it broke his connection to humanity itself. And unfortunately, Ivan was about to show just how creative one could be without such inconvenient restraints. In 1565, Ivan had a brilliant idea that would make Stalin proud. Why trust existing institutions when you can create your own personal terror squad? Enter the oprichniki. 6,000 men dressed in black robes, riding black horses, carrying brooms and severed dog heads as symbols. The brooms represented sweeping away treason. The dog heads, a warning about the fate of anyone who opposed the Tsar. Here's the terrifying part, these weren't just random thugs. Ivan handpicked educated, intelligent men who understood exactly what they were doing. Many were minor nobles who'd been passed over for promotion, hungry for power and perfectly willing to torture their way to it. The oprichniki operated under one simple rule: anyone accused of treason was guilty until proven innocent. And proving innocence usually involved surviving interrogation techniques that would make medieval inquisitors cringe. They'd drag entire families from their homes in midnight raids. Confiscate properties first, ask questions later. Novgorod, 1570. Ivan becomes convinced that this wealthy trading city is planning to defect to Lithuania. His evidence: some suspicious correspondence that was probably forged by his own agents. The oprichniki descend on Novgorod like a plague. For 5 weeks, they systematically torture and execute anyone with connections to the city's government. Estimates range from 2,700 to 12,000 dead. The really sick part? Ivan treated these expeditions like entertainment. He'd set up pavilions outside torture sites, complete with food and wine, turning mass murder into a social event for his inner circle. By 1570, the oprichniki had become so brutal that even Ivan's own supporters were horrified. But Ivan had created something he couldn't control, a machine designed to find enemies that would keep finding them, whether they existed or not. By 1581, Ivan's paranoia had consumed everything: his advisors, his nobles, his people. But there was one relationship he'd somehow kept sacred: his bond with his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. Crown Prince Ivan was everything his father had once been: intelligent, compassionate, genuinely concerned about Russia's future. At 27, he'd proven himself in battle and earned respect from the very people his father had spent decades terrorizing. In a twisted way, the prince had become the last living reminder of who Ivan the Terrible used to be, back when he had a functioning moral compass. The irony cuts deep: while Ivan Sr. grew more isolated and suspicious, his son was building bridges. The prince would quietly countermand his father's more extreme orders, saving lives while maintaining plausible deniability. Russian chroniclers describe him as the kingdom's secret protector, essentially doing damage control for his father's reign of terror. But paranoia doesn't recognize family bonds. By late 1581, Ivan had convinced himself that his own son was plotting against him. The evidence? Prince Ivan had been asking too many questions about military strategy. He'd been meeting privately with generals. He'd even dared to criticize some of his father's more brutal policies in front of witnesses. The final straw came during a heated argument about the ongoing Livonian War. Prince Ivan suggested that maybe, just maybe, torturing prisoners wasn't the most effective military strategy. He pointed out that Ivan's reign of terror had driven away most of Russia's competent administrators. For Ivan the Terrible, this wasn't political disagreement, it was treason. His own flesh and blood had joined the imaginary conspiracy against him. November 16, 1581. Father and son are arguing again, this time about Prince Ivan's pregnant wife. The Tsar thinks she's dressed too provocatively, apparently showing your ankles while 6 months pregnant counts as scandalous behavior in Ivan's increasingly unhinged worldview. The argument escalates quickly. Prince Ivan defends his wife with the kind of passion that only comes from genuine love, something his father hasn't felt in over 20 years. But to Ivan the Terrible, passionate defense sounds like defiance. And defiance, in his paranoid mind, equals treason. The throne room falls silent except for 2 voices growing louder and angrier. Courtiers pretend to study their shoes, knowing that witnessing royal family drama could easily become a death sentence. The prince is pleading now, trying to make his father understand that not everything is a conspiracy. That sometimes people disagree without plotting rebellion. Ivan the Terrible reaches for his staff, a heavy iron-pointed walking stick that doubles as a weapon. It's the same staff he's used to intimidate countless nobles, the symbol of his absolute authority. But instead of just threatening, something snaps. One swing. The pointed tip catches his son directly in the temple. Prince Ivan crumples instantly. Blood pools beneath his head as he convulses on the marble floor. For a moment that stretches into eternity, Ivan the Terrible realizes what he's done. The paranoid tyrant disappears, replaced by a horrified father dropping to his knees, cradling his dying son's head. "I've killed my son. I've killed my son." Ivan screams, trying desperately to stop the bleeding with his bare hands. But 20 years of practiced violence can't be undone by a few minutes of regret. Prince Ivan dies 3 days later, never regaining consciousness. With him dies the Rurik dynasty's legitimate succession, Russia's hope for competent leadership, and the last fragment of Ivan the Terrible's humanity. The men who'd spent decades destroying his enemies had finally destroyed himself. Ivan the Terrible lived for 7 more years after murdering his heir, but he was already dead inside. The men who'd terrorized an entire empire spent his final days weeping over his son's grave, begging God for forgiveness that would never come. Russia paid the ultimate price for one man's unchecked paranoia. With no competent heir, the kingdom plunged into the time of troubles, 15 years of civil war, foreign invasion, and near collapse. The Rurik dynasty, which had ruled for over 700 years, ended not with military defeat or political revolution, but with a father's rage destroying his own bloodline. Ivan the Terrible died alone in 1584, playing chess with a courtier who was probably terrified to win. His last words, according to witnesses, were about his son.